If you've made it this far into the story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. It's always a joy to hear how far these tales manage to travel. Your comments truly help bring this little historical world to life. And if you're enjoying the journey, kindly consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. In the early 1840s, as England adjusted to the youthful steadiness of Queen Victoria's rule, Lady Clarissa Wincombe moved through Wincombe House like a beautifully kept artifact, polished, admired, and untouched by anything resembling warmth. Her days unfolded according to expectations fixed long before her marriage. Each hour assigned to duties she performed flawlessly yet without conviction. Visitors praised her poise, servants admired her gentleness, and her husband considered her consistency a political asset rather than evidence of a soul quietly starving. Still, she endured, for endurance was the one virtue no one ever taught her to question in those rooms. Edmund Wincombe, 30 years her senior, had selected Clarissa not for companionship but for lineage, decorum, and the docile steadiness he believed essential to a statesman's household. He treated affection as an unnecessary indulgence, a distraction from parliamentary obligations that consumed his waking hours. Clarissa attempted, in the first years, to earn some spark of regard, but every attempt dissolved beneath his mild indifference, leaving her with a quiet understanding that she existed primarily to preserve appearances. It was a realization that settled inside her like cold ash, quiet, heavy, irrevocable within her daily composure and silent suffering for years. London season, which should have offered diversion, instead felt to Clarissa like a polished stage upon which she performed the role assigned to her with faultless grace. She attended operas, teas, and interminable gatherings, each one drenched in the same whispered vigilance that governed women of her rank. The matrons of society noted every glance she exchanged, every moment she lingered too long near a doorway, every hint that her thoughts wandered beyond her husband's political ambitions. Such scrutiny carved distance around her, shaping her into a figure admired but never known and always observed without true companionship in society. Yet beneath Clarissa's measured calm lived a persistent ache, a sensation she rarely permitted herself to acknowledge, lest it grow too large to contain. She longed not for grand declarations but for the simple assurance of being regarded with genuine interest, of being spoken to with tenderness rather than courtesy. Such desires, modest as they were, had become dangerous luxuries in a world where a woman's reputation could collapse beneath the faintest suggestion of dissatisfaction. So she buried them in silence, letting the years erode her sense of possibility until only echoes remained within her quiet heart each day passing. The winter reception announced by the palace arrived like a summons from a world Clarissa no longer trusted, yet could not refuse. Edmund considered the event essential to maintaining alliances, and Clarissa, as always, prepared herself with quiet precision, aware that her presence served his interests far more than her own. She dressed for the evening with the practiced serenity of someone accustomed to armor disguised as silk, fastening each clasp with the unspoken hope that the night might pass without incident and without awakening old sorrow that lingered beneath her stillness, shaping her quiet expectations for the evening ahead. As their carriage approached St. James's Palace, Clarissa watched the frost glitter across the cobblestones, each shard of ice catching the lamplight like a tiny, indifferent star. The sight sharpened her awareness of how small she felt within the machinery of court life, a single figure moving through currents shaped by power she would never touch. Even Edmund, immersed in his calculations for the evening, seemed unaware of her unease, speaking only to remind her of the alliances requiring careful acknowledgement. She nodded, though her thoughts wandered toward memories she rarely permitted to surface within her that cold night before. Inside the palace, warmth and brilliance collided in a spectacle designed to impress foreign dignitaries, yet Clarissa sensed the underlying tension that threaded through every diplomatic gathering. The air shimmered with conversations about treaties, tariffs, and alliances, matters she understood only through the edges of Edmund's fragmented explanations. Still, she held her posture with unwavering composure, aware that even a moment of visible fatigue might reflect poorly upon her husband's aspirations. Her gaze drifted over the crowd, searching for something unnamed within the glittering tumult that pressed upon her senses like a distant, beckoning restlessness within her chest that night. Clarissa was accustomed to feeling invisible in such rooms, yet tonight a thread of awareness tugged at her, as though some unseen shift had unsettled the predictable rhythms around her. She sensed eyes upon her, not prying, not critical, but perceptive, almost curious in a way she had forgotten one could be. When she turned slightly, her gaze brushed across a distant figure, indistinct in the candlelight yet marked by a bearing that suggested authority tempered by fatigue. She looked away before he noticed, But something within her stirred unexpectedly, as though awakened gently by an unseen force that night alone. As the evening progressed, Clarissa found herself drifting toward the edges of conversation, seeking fresh air more than diversion, her senses still touched by the faint impression of that distant presence. She stepped momentarily aside as a cluster of diplomats passed, their cloaks trailing the scent of winter and travel, and she felt a subtle prickle of anticipation she could neither define nor dismiss. It unsettled her, that small flicker of possibility, yet she allowed it to linger in the corner of her awareness, not daring to name it but unable to discard it fully as she waited in silence. By the time she returned to Edmund's side, Clarissa carried within her a quiet tension, as if the night itself had whispered that her world, so carefully measured, might be shifting toward something unanticipated. She remained composed, responding to Edmund's inquiries with practiced serenity, but an undercurrent of restlessness threaded through her, urging her to look once more toward the crowd she had briefly scanned. She did not know what she sought, only that something in the room had changed, and that this shift pressed gently against her isolation, as though offering a breath she had never felt before that. The murmur of diplomatic pleasantries swelled through the ballroom as Clarissa steadied herself near a gilded archway, her gaze drawn once more toward the indistinct figure whose presence had unsettled her composure. When he finally stepped into clearer light, she recognized the quiet gravity that marked men accustomed to bearing responsibility without applause. His face, though composed, carried the faint shadows of sleepless deliberation, and the subtle restraint in his movements suggested a cautious mind accustomed to secrecy. She sensed immediately that he had not come merely to exchange polite trivialities, but to observe, evaluate, and perhaps protect interests unseen by most of the glittering assembly around them. The Duke of Ravensholt had been absent from society for so long that many whispered he no longer existed beyond rumor, yet his return this evening felt deliberate rather than nostalgic. Clarissa watched him from a distance, noting the measured sweep of his gaze across the room, the slight narrowing of his eyes when he paused near groups of foreign dignitaries, and the courteous nods he offered without inviting conversation. His presence was like a muted chord in a loud symphony, subtle, but unmistakably transformative for anyone attuned to the undercurrent of the evening's tensions. She attempted to redirect her focus toward Edmund, who was engrossed in a discussion with a senior minister, yet her thoughts continued drifting back to the Duke with disquieting insistence. Something about him contradicted the prevailing atmosphere of decorative diplomacy. He seemed anchored in a deeper purpose that sharpened the air around him, allowing Clarissa to sense a realm of motives beyond the polished smiles and practiced greetings. The feeling unsettled her, for she had grown accustomed to predictability within these gatherings, and this man's arrival had fractured that careful predictability with a single, unspoken presence. When Clarissa stepped forward to follow her husband toward another circle of dignitaries, she caught the Duke's eyes upon her, not boldly but with a quiet recognition that startled her more than any overt stare would have done. His gaze held neither admiration nor impropriety. Rather, it carried the weight of genuine observation, as though he saw the person beneath the polished exterior she presented to the world. The awareness jolted her heartbeat, sending a rush of warmth across her skin in a room otherwise chilled by formality. A passing cluster of guests momentarily blocked her view, and when they dispersed, she realized the Duke had moved closer, though without haste or intention that could draw notice. She glimpsed him exchanging a few low words with a palace official, but even in conversation, his attention seemed fractionally attuned to her presence. The subtlety of his awareness made her feel simultaneously exposed and strangely reassured, as if he had already noticed the quiet fatigue she carried but did not judge it. Clarissa drifted toward the terrace doors under the guise of seeking cooler air, though in truth she longed for a moment unobserved by the relentless scrutiny of the ballroom. The cold night pressed gently against her when she stepped outside, carrying the scent of frost and distant wood smoke from nearby chimneys. St. James's Park stretched in dusky silence beyond the balustrade, its lamplights casting trembling reflections across the dark surface of the channel. For the first time that evening, she exhaled without fearing that someone might interpret her breath as discontent. She leaned slightly against the stone railing, grateful for the solitude, yet the quiet rustle of footsteps behind her announced that she was no longer alone. When she turned, she found the Duke standing a respectful distance away, as though ensuring she had ample opportunity to dismiss him if she wished. His expression was calm, composed, but tinged with a gentleness she had not expected from a man burdened by such a formidable reputation. "I hope I am not intruding," he said, his voice low enough to remain private yet firm enough to convey sincerity rather than strategy. Clarissa hesitated, aware that any conversation between them, however innocent, could invite speculation, but something in his tone disarmed her caution. She offered a slight nod, allowing him to remain, and he approached only as far as propriety permitted. He remarked upon the stifling warmth of the ballroom, the pressing demands of diplomacy, and the weariness evident in many attendees' eyes, though his own gaze remained steady and attentive. Clarissa found herself responding with unexpected candor, admitting that such gatherings often left her feeling more observed than included. The Duke listened without offering empty reassurance, and the authenticity of his silence made her feel more understood than any words of polite consolation could have achieved. As their conversation deepened, he revealed glimpses of the burdens he carried, though never enough to breach the confidentiality clearly required by his position. He spoke carefully of political uncertainties, of delicate negotiations that required vigilance, and of the cost such responsibilities demanded from those entrusted with managing them. Clarissa sensed the unspoken weight behind his words, grief for his late wife, guilt woven through memories he did not describe, and an enduring commitment to duties that had likely isolated him as thoroughly as her own marriage had isolated her. The wind shifted, carrying a faint chill across the terrace, and Clarissa instinctively drew her shawl tighter. The Duke noticed but did not step closer. Instead, he offered a quiet remark about the unpredictability of winter evenings, his sensitivity to her comfort further distinguishing him from the many men who valued appearances over genuine regard. His restraint touched her more deeply than any bold gesture could have, for it demonstrated respect rather than presumption. Their exchange seemed suspended in a delicate balance, as though the night itself held its breath around them. Clarissa became acutely aware of how rare it felt to speak without performing, to be regarded without being analyzed, and to exist, in this brief moment, as a woman rather than a political asset. The realization stirred an ache within her, not painful but poignant, like discovering a long-forgotten memory of warmth she once believed impossible to recover. She sensed that the Duke felt the same subtle shift, though neither mentioned it. Instead, he offered a final thought about the fragility of peace in rooms filled with ambition, and she responded with a measured reflection on the fragility of peace in homes governed by duty. Their eyes held for a suspended heartbeat, a moment that acknowledged, without naming, their shared understanding of constraint. A distant burst of laughter from the ballroom disrupted the quiet, reminding Clarissa of the world awaiting her return. The Duke inclined his head with a solemnity that felt almost protective, stepping back to allow her to choose whether the moment should end. She thanked him, her voice soft but steady, and he replied with a gentle assurance that their conversation had been neither improper nor unwelcome. As Clarissa stepped toward the doorway, she felt the familiar weight of expectation settle over her once more, yet something within her had undeniably shifted. The night no longer felt empty. The world no longer felt inescapably sealed. And as she crossed the threshold back into the glittering tumult, she sensed that the Duke's presence would continue to reverberate through her thoughts long after the candles of the reception had burned to ash. The morning after the reception dawned with a muted gray light that crept across Clarissa's room like a hesitant messenger, unsure whether to bring comfort or warning. She rose with the same practiced grace she had cultivated over the past 5 years, yet the familiar routine felt faintly misaligned, as if the world had shifted a fraction of an inch while she slept. Her lady's maid noted the change without comment, though Clarissa sensed the woman's curiosity as she fastened the final hook of her gown. She schooled her features into calm neutrality, refusing to let the quiet upheaval within her ripple through her outward composure, for she knew too well how swiftly the household absorbed signs of inner discord. Edmund Wincombe awaited her in the breakfast room, already surrounded by documents that cluttered the polished table like a miniature battlefield. He greeted her with habitual civility, his mind elsewhere before the second syllable left his mouth. As he launched into a summary of the previous night's political impressions, Clarissa listened with polite attentiveness, though her thoughts drifted toward the terrace, toward the Duke's steady gaze, his measured sincerity, the inexplicable ease she had felt in his presence. She fought to maintain focus, reminding herself that Edmund depended upon her unerring steadiness, yet the memory lingered with disquieting clarity, seeking purchase in the quiet spaces of her thoughts. Edmund spoke at length about various officials, praising one's strategic insight, lamenting another's obstinacy, and remarking pointedly upon the unexpected reappearance of the Duke of Ravensholt. The mention of his name sent a subtle shiver through Clarissa, though she masked it behind a sip of tea. Edmund regarded the Duke with deep mistrust, convinced his withdrawal from society and rumored proximity to the crown concealed motives that could unsettle the political equilibrium Edmund strove to maintain. Clarissa offered a non-committal response to his remarks, careful to avoid betraying even the mildest personal sentiment, though a faint unease trickled through her as she wondered whether Edmund's suspicions might one day cast shadows she could not escape. Throughout the day, Clarissa moved through her routine with outward composure, yet her thoughts remained drawn to the conversation that had unfolded beneath the cold stars of the terrace. She recalled the Duke's quiet attentiveness, the unfeigned respect in his tone, and the faint sorrow that had threaded through his words like a low, unbroken note. These memories unsettled her not because they were improper, but because they felt meaningful in a way that challenged the stillness she had accepted as her life's permanent landscape. She feared the hope that flickered beneath those memories, for hope, once awakened, was notoriously difficult to confine. As dusk settled, she retreated to her sitting room with a book she had little intention of reading, hoping solitude might soothe the unease that had grown steadily throughout the afternoon. Instead, her thoughts sharpened, as though the quiet insisted upon honesty she had long evaded. She realized with sudden clarity that the night on the terrace had not simply offered comfort, it had revealed the extent of her loneliness. What she felt was not infatuation but recognition, a recognition of gentleness, of understanding, of the possibility that someone might see her as more than a political ornament. That realization both steadied and frightened her, for it illuminated the depth of the fissure within a life she had forced into stillness. A knock interrupted her thoughts. The butler entered with a sealed envelope, informing her it had been delivered by a discreet courier with instructions to place it directly into Lady Wincombe's hands. Clarissa's breath caught with swift apprehension as she broke the seal, recognizing the precise handwriting she had seen only briefly the night before. The letter contained no impropriety, merely a few lines written with careful restraint. The Duke expressed gratitude for their conversation, acknowledged its unexpected significance, and assured her that he would not impose upon her peace but hoped she would accept his words as evidence of sincere respect. He ended with a warning to exercise caution in the days ahead, for certain conversations overheard at the reception suggested that tensions within diplomatic circles might seep into domestic spheres. Clarissa folded the letter with trembling fingers, aware that its very existence was perilous. She hid it among the pages of her book, though she knew the greater danger lay not in the paper but in the emotions it stirred. She sensed instinctively that the Duke's warning was not mere courtesy. It carried the weight of responsibility familiar to men who operated in the quiet margins of political affairs. Her pulse quickened with unease as she wondered whether Edmund's increasing agitation over diplomatic matters was related, and whether she herself now stood closer to the edge of events she scarcely understood. That evening, as she joined Edmund in the drawing-room, she attempted to appear unaffected, but Edmund studied her with unusual focus. He remarked on her pallor, his tone threaded with impatience rather than concern, and questioned whether the reception had exhausted her. She offered a calm reassurance, but his gaze lingered upon her with faint suspicion. Clarissa sensed that he, too, felt the shift in the air, though he misread its source entirely. His unease pressed upon her like a tightening band, urging her to tread carefully in the days ahead. Later, when Clarissa retired to her room, the house settling into silence around her, she allowed herself to reflect honestly on the path before her. She understood that the night on the terrace had awakened a vulnerability she had long concealed, yet it had also illuminated an inner strength she had underestimated. She did not know what role the Duke might yet play in the gathering tensions Edmund had alluded to, nor what consequences might arise from his return to society, but she sensed that their brief connection had woven her into a narrative far larger than either of them had intended. As she extinguished the final candle, Clarissa felt neither regret nor fear, but a cautious resolve. The world around her was shifting, subtly but unmistakably, and she sensed that her own life, once defined entirely by obedience and quiet endurance, stood poised at the edge of transformation. Whether that transformation would bring liberation or danger, she could not yet discern, but she knew one thing with unmistakable clarity: she would no longer move through her days as though nothing in her heart had changed. And somewhere in the quiet of the night, she sensed that the Duke of Ravensholt, burdened by secrets and duty, felt that same awakening, even if both understood the cost such awareness might demand.